You've heard it many times over the past few months. Despite the scandal rocking the Roman Catholic Church in America, the vast majority of priests are honorable men, trusted leaders, compassionate keepers of the faith and the faithful. Tonight, the story of a neighborhood priest whose commitment to his calling demanded more than he ever dreamed. He was forced to make a choice that pitted the teachings of his church against the voice of his conscience. It all started when a desperate young man came to him and confessed to murder. Or did he? Here's Mike Taibbi.
We went in, we sat on his bed inside, and he poured out his grief and his torment.
Father Joseph Toll clearly remembers the winter day in 1989 when a neighborhood teen named Jesus Fornes phoned him and said, "We have to talk."
He had said he couldn't sleep, he couldn't eat, and he couldn't live with himself.
Because he had to confess to a terrible sin.
At that point, he revealed to me all the details of the murder.
And Fornes was not only confessing to murder, he was also in anguish because two innocent men were about to go to prison for a crime he committed with two other accomplices.
While many in the South Bronx neighborhood of Hunts Point bared their souls to the street priest known as Father Joe, it was this one conversation with Jesus Fornes that would torment the priest and come to dominate his life. What they talked about, how they talked, and how it was remembered would raise disturbing questions about the rules of the criminal justice system, and more importantly to a Roman Catholic priest about the rules of his own church.
Because Father Joe knew then what he knows now about the cornerstone of his religion, that if you're Catholic and you confess your sins to a priest, even the worst sins imaginable, the priest offers forgiveness in the name of God and can tell no one what you've told him.
I would die before I reveal a confessional secret.
The secret Fornes revealed to Father Joe was about a murder in 1987 in this public park in the Hunts Point section of the South Bronx, a neighborhood beset by drugs and gangs and violence.
It was a brutal murder involving a baseball bat, and a knife, in which this man, Jose Rivera, was killed.
The word on the street was that 27-year-old Jose Rivera had been killed in a revenge attack, an argument over a young woman at the root of it. 3 young men were arrested, one of whom committed suicide while out on bail, but 2 others, Jose Morales and Ruben Montalvo, who'd sworn from the outset they'd had nothing to do with the murder. In fact, neither of the high school teenagers had ever been in trouble with the law.
Did you go anywhere near Kelly Park that night?
Not at all.
Ruben, did you go anywhere near Kelly Park that night?
They had volunteered to be photographed, questioned, and placed in police lineups. But in December of 1988, Morales and Montalvo went to trial. The prosecution had no physical or forensic evidence against either defendant and had only 2 witnesses, the victim's girlfriend, who said she watched the assault after an afternoon spent drinking, and her son, who said he didn't see the actual murder but did see Montalvo at the scene. Morales took the stand, and so did 7 alibi witnesses, all of them insisting the 2 teens were never in a position to commit the murder. But the jury didn't buy it. The verdict, guilty. And 1 month later, just before sentencing, Jesus Fornes called Father Joe.
Did he blurt it out? Did he say, "Father, I killed somebody"?
I did it, and he gave me all the details of what he had done and what the others had done, yes.
The others, Fornes told his priest, were 2 accomplices, including the suspect who'd committed suicide, Peter Ramirez, and not Ruben Montalvo and Jose Morales, now on the way to prison after being wrongly convicted. Fornes, the priest recalled, was beside himself.
We wanted to keep these 2 boys from suffering the penalty for the crime that he did.
Did he want to pay for the crime that he did?
That was the whole point of his conversation with me. I can't let them be blamed for something I did.
Father Joe's advice, it may not be too late. Go tell the court what you've told me. The distraught teenager said he would. And finally,
I said, "Do you want to be forgiven?" He said, "Of course." And we prayed together, and I spoke to him about the love of God.
So Fornes went to this Bronx courthouse the very next day and confessed to Anthony Servino, the lawyer for one of the convicted defendants.
Kept repeating the line, "I did the crime, I'll do the time."
Now in a fever of confession, Fornes kept telling his story to the mother of one of the defendants. and to lawyers at the courthouse. When Fornes found out that the DA would not reconsider the case, even though he was ready to accept the blame, he took the Fifth Amendment and said nothing. Without Fornes's testimony, Morales and Montalvo would take the fall.
Well, the bottom line of this was going to be that you two guys were going to stay on the hook. What did you think, Ruben?
Thought my life was over with.
For Angie Montalvo and the families of both young men, the sentence, 15 years to life, was devastating.
I couldn't believe they gave him 15 years. He was only 16.
And what was Father Joe thinking? Sure, he says, he was upset by what he says was just another failure by a criminal justice system less interested in justice than in its batting average. Jesus Fornes, in the priest's view, had at least done the right thing. In fact, a very great and courageous thing.
I told him afterwards, look, you've done your best. You've done everything that you could. What the court does with the information you've given them, you were not responsible for.
Months went by, then years. And Father Joe did sometimes think of the day Fornes had called him to spill his story, and he began to wonder, privately, had he done his best?
I didn't talk to other people about it. It was a matter of leaving things in God's hands and praying for them.
And besides, Father Joe knew, he couldn't come forward himself, couldn't just march up to the DA's office using his stature as a priest and demand justice, because as a matter of religion, his original conversation with Fornes was privileged and confidential.
My frustration, of course, was that at the time I felt there was nothing I could do.
Because you thought it was a confession. You thought it might have been a confession.
Well, put it that way, I thought it might have been a confession.
Did you ever go to Jesus and say, look, this thing's they're still in there. And they didn't get the death sentence, but they got a take-your-life sentence, and they're going to be in there for a long time. Can we rethink what we might do here?
No. After that time, he was crushed. I think he became, cynical and said, I did no good then, and I am no good.
He gave up.
He gave up.
And so did Father Joe, at least on the idea of doing anything on his own to get two young men he believed to be innocent out of jail. Gave up, but not permanently.
Returning to our story, Father Joe is facing a painful dilemma. Whether to tell authorities that a young man has confessed to a murder for which two other young men are now in prison. Father Joe believes he can't go to the DA himself because what he was told, though not in a confessional, by Catholic law, must remain confidential. But what exactly constitutes a confession? Again, Mike Taibbi.
The years were adding up. Morales and Montalvo were numbers in the system, and it seemed they had no one in their corners except their families and the street priest from St. Athanasius Parish, Father Joe. He wrote the young men in prison, "It must be terrible for you, falsely accused and convicted."
Our correspondence was just based on, moral support, telling me to, have faith in God and, be strong and all that.
Father Joe didn't say why he believed the boys were innocent, didn't say that Jesus Fornes had confessed to him that he'd committed the crime with two different accomplices.
Just try and encourage them that as they knew they were innocent, Jesus was innocent too, and that they were in good company.
But saying that Jesus is innocent is an act of faith. Saying that Morales and Montalvo were innocent was on your part an act of knowledge, something you knew.
Yes.
What was the difference there? How was it affecting you?
I felt that there was nothing that I could do except to support them.
But 7 years into their incarceration, the men in prison thought there was something Father Joe could do, something that might finally lead to a successful appeal. In November of 1996, Montalvo wrote to his priest, "I could easily get my case back in court if I could find someone of a credible reputation and profession to attest to their knowledge of my case. I was hoping you would be willing." Father Joe wasn't willing, not yet, but he did hint at his torment over what he knew yet could not say. "I will help you in any way I can," he wrote. "That does not oblige me to speak of things I know only in confidence as a priest."
But you must have been thinking about it all along. You must have thought about it several times.
Is there anything I can do?
From prison, Morales and Montalvo kept pushing. They were on the way to becoming jailhouse lawyers, and they now suspected there was something Father Joe might have heard in someone's confession that could be crucial to their case. They weren't sure what it was exactly, but they knew it had convinced Father Joe of their innocence.
2 months later, Montalvo wrote, "I know you know what happened, and if it wasn't shared with you under the cloak of the priesthood, I'm hoping you'd be willing to share it with the court." Father Joe wasn't ready to talk about what he knew and how he knew it, partly because he didn't want to create new problems for Jesus Fornes.
Because he was alive, it would seem to be a betrayal at that time.
But the priest was also still certain the Fornes confession was a privileged communication, and he knew that a priest can never divulge or be forced by a court to divulge what he hears as part of a Roman Catholic confession. Meanwhile, the appeals and motions filed on behalf of Morales and Montalvo were rejected, time after time. For both men, young fathers unable to raise their children, the days in prison seemed so very long.
Not being able to be with my family was very difficult.
Then, in late 1997, Fornes was murdered, shot gangland style.
Were you surprised when you heard it?
No. Hurt, but not surprised. That was the direction he was going in.
Fornes was gone now, but even though the seal of confession survives death, it did get Father Joe thinking, slowly. It wasn't until March of 2000, 11 years after the confession, that Father Joe wrote to Morales, "I was probably the last person Jesus Fornes spoke to before going to court and admitting that he participated in that man's killing." Now it clicked for Morales. Father Joe knew the men were innocent because Fornes had confided in his priest. If the priest now came forward, would an appeals court reconsider?
Went to the law library, did a little research, and then I wrote Father Joe back and asked him could he give me an affidavit.
An affidavit, a sworn statement about the Jesus Fornes murder confession, signed by the priest who'd heard it.
Jose Morales, in writing to me, suggested that there was some hope that my coming forward would bolster, reinforce, back up, repeat, really, what was not a secret, but which was already divulged and known to the court in 1988.
Now Father Joe thought very hard about the nature of his relationship with Fornes and about their conversation on that long-ago day. And he wondered, for the first time, was it really a confession, a sacramental confession?
I really had not given it the thought, that it needed, nor the prayer that it needed. The nature of a seal of confession, privileged communication, committed secret, something was no longer a secret, but that morally should be kept secret anyway. All of these questions come to one's mind.
Questions he struggled to answer.
He didn't say, "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned."
No. He was an unchurched boy.
Yeah. But he knew you were a man of the cloth. You have the collar. He knew that you are Father Joe.
That's fine. So he should be able to trust me, and he should be able to tell me the truth. And I gave him absolution at that point.
Father Toll was faced with a thorny religious issue. Catholic doctrine is clear. Confession consists of a penitent confessing, seeking forgiveness, and receiving the forgiveness in God's name known as absolution.
I absolve you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. That absolution...
Father Toll concedes he gave Fornes absolution.
But it's absolution, not a blessing.
That's fine.
Absolution.
Yes, it's fine. It's absolution. One must understand, you don't hold forgiveness back. In other words, when I gave him absolution, and I gave him the forgiveness of the church and the forgiveness of God through the sacrament, that, I believe, is what gave him the strength to go forward.
And that was the thought Father Joe kept coming back to. Jesus Fornes wanted to go forward. He didn't want to simply confess his sins, be forgiven, and go home.
He didn't just want to get it off his chest, he wanted to do something.
Exactly. That was the whole point of his conversation with me. I can't let them be blamed for something I did.
Suddenly, Father Joe was using the word conversation to describe that meeting with troubled Jesus Fornes, a meeting the priest remembered as a young man's search for the spiritual guidance that helped him to publicly admit his crime.
On good canonical terms, I judged that this was, first of all, no longer a secret, and that the nature of his conversation with me was not a private confession between him and God.
Having reached that conclusion, Father Joe was now faced not with theory or theology, but with the practical decision to write that affidavit or not. He wrote it. Jesus Fornes spoke to me and admitted that he and 2 other companions, not Morales or Montalvo, were the ones responsible for the murder. Had I known that such knowledge might have been crucial as corroboration, they would have come forward earlier. All those years later, nearly 13 years later, Father Joe, with his stature as a Catholic priest, was on the record, in writing anyway.
My affidavit, I gather, was late arriving, so to speak. I think everybody was on edge as to whether it was going to have any effect at all.
On edge, sure, but some were newly hopeful. Angie Montalvo now dared to think that after years in prison, her son Ruben and his friend Jose Morales might finally have a real shot at freedom.
I was just praying that something would happen. They got to believe the priest, because if they don't believe the priest, who are they going to believe?
And next, Father Joe tells all.
To end the situation.
But would it help the innocent men in prison? And what price would this priest pay for breaking his silence?
You had to know that when you came forward with this,
Yes,
it was going to raise a firestorm.
absolutely.
The moment, literally, of truth. And now the conclusion to our story. It has been a difficult decision, but now that Jesus Fornes has died, Father Joe believes he must tell the court about his conversation with Fornes, in which the young man confessed to murder. If he does, will the two innocent men who were convicted of that crime finally go free? Once again, Mike Tybee.
By the time Father Joseph Toll showed up to testify in federal court, reporters were all over the story, asking how a man of God could possibly keep silent, knowing innocent men were languishing in prison, and wondering what breaking that silence might mean now.
I suppose everybody wants to talk to me.
You had to know that when you came forward with this,
Yes,
it was going to raise a firestorm.
absolutely. And that's the reason, the real reason why I went to the Archdiocese, to alert them to the fact that this was going to happen.
Actually, by the time Father Toll contacted the Archdiocese, he'd already submitted a brief on-the-record affidavit for Jose Morales as part of a motion for a new hearing in federal court.
With two boys in prison for 13 years, you have to balance the values off. And if some people are going to be confused, or some people are going to believe that I broke the seal of confession, God help us, there's not much I can do about that.
Now, it wasn't just that brief affidavit. A Catholic priest was about to reveal all the details of a long-ago confession by a troubled youth named Jesus Fornes. Only he wasn't using the word confession to describe the story Fornes told him, a story the priest known as Father Joe believed might now free two innocent men. He says the Catholic Archdiocese of New York supported him.
They were gracious enough to make a public statement to that fact.
It was July 16, 2001, when Father Joe went public on the witness stand in federal court with the story Jesus Fornes had told him more than a dozen years earlier.
It was a last-ditch attempt to get the judicial system to realize that this young man, who had been incarcerated for 13 years almost at that point, was actually innocent.
Defense attorneys Randa Maher and Jeff Patel knew Father Joe's testimony was critical to their appeal. If Montalvo and Morales were to be proven innocent of murdering Jose Rivera, the Fornes story that had never been heard by their trial jury would have to be heard now, and would have to be believed by Judge Denny Chin. Everyone who'd heard the Fornes story 13 years ago took the stand.
So that's how we came up with 5 witnesses who had heard Fornes' statement.
But Father Joe was the key, a Catholic priest after all.
Certainly under secular law, which is the law of this country, there was no reason why Father Toll, couldn't come forward and testify.
Still, the prosecutors tried everything to block Father Joe's testimony, first arguing that it should be barred on religious grounds, and when that failed and Father Joe did take the stand, that he shouldn't be believed. Judge Chin listened to Father Joe and was convinced. It's highly unlikely, the judge ruled, that Fornes would have lied to the priest, and he had nothing to gain and everything to lose by telling them of his role in the murder.
And the judge went further. The prosecution's case was incredibly weak to begin with, he found, and would never have resulted in murder convictions against Morales and Montalvo had the trial jury heard the story Jesus Fornes told so many people, that he'd done it with 2 other accomplices. And that, the judge ruled, coupled with the priest's powerful testimony now, made it unthinkable that Morales and Montalvo should spend even one more day in prison. The judge declared them innocent.
When they walked out of that courtroom and into the sunshine of freedom, it was delicious.
That was a beautiful feeling, you know. Happy as I've been for years, you know. Since my son was born.
I felt like I was in heaven. You know, I came floating out the front doors.
The DA's office declined all interview requests and instead issued a written statement saying the prosecutor still believed the jury was right and that the men who were convicted were guilty.
The district attorney has still not admitted that they prosecuted the wrong people.
The men wrongly jailed have thought a lot about Father Joe. They say they listened to his testimony, understood his pain, and have granted him a kind of absolution.
Father Joe is a good man, and I know it bothered him knowing that me and Ruben was innocent, but I believe he did the right thing.
I have told everyone that this was not a situation of formal confession in the Catholic Church.
Others don't believe that at all, for one reason or another.
This guy was a penitent. He confessed his sins, and he got absolution from this priest. That's confession. That's the seal of confession. He can't break it. On the other hand, if it wasn't a confession, why did he wait 12 years?
I can't worry about that. I've never felt more peace in my entire life. You have to live with yourself, and I have to live with myself as a priest and as somebody who loved Jesus Fornes very deeply and loved everybody else involved despite their sins and mine.
Father Joe is trying to get on with his life, and so are the innocent men who spent 12 years in prison. Both Jose Morales and Ruben Montalvo have jobs, and Jose is also attending college classes at night, hoping to become a lawyer. That's all for this edition of Dateline Friday. We'll see you again for Dateline Sunday at 7, 6 Central. I'm Stone Phillips, and for all of us at NBC News, good night.
For a transcript, call 1-800-77...